I'm going to talk you through the ladder stitch, or otherwise known as the invisible stitch. Hi, I'm Esther, and I try to sew stuff that supports a sustainable lifestyle. I'm going to show you an overview first so that you get the general gist of the stitch. Then I'll move on to some very detailed instructions so that you can understand the process, and then I will grab some fabric and sew with you right from the very beginning, going step by step so that you can follow along. You'll get the hang of it really easily and you'll be able to use it to mend, fix, sew, so many things. Okay, so for the overview, I'm going to use this baby playmat as an example. I sewed 2 pieces of fabric together, then I turn it the right way out through this little gap so that all the messy guts are hidden inside. Now that it's the right way out, I used the ladder stitch to hand sew it closed. With a regular stitch, all the stitches are in line with each other, but with the ladder stitch, we jump from the top fabric to the bottom fabric, then back up to the top fabric in a repetitive pattern. So in this example, I'll do 1 stitch on the navy fabric, then 1 stitch on the green fabric, then I'll go back to the navy fabric. Now this is called a ladder stitch because you can see that as I'm stitching from one side to the other, we create these little lines in between the fabric, which as we continue to stitch begins to look like the rungs of a ladder. I also mentioned that this can be referred to as the invisible stitch, but right now they are obviously very, very visible. So the trick is, after we've sewn a series of stitches from side to side, perhaps 5 or 6, we then pull the needle and thread firmly but carefully, which results in the stitches coming closer together, thereby closing the gap and now being invisible. That is the overview, so on to some instructions. I've drawn up a diagram here that might help, hopefully. The dots are the points where the needle either pokes into the fabric or out of the fabric. Each line here is a stitch. The dotted lines are the hidden stitches. You won't be able to see them because they're on the other side of the fabric, while the unbroken lines, the black thick lines, are the stitches that you can see, the ones that are in between the 2 fabrics that form the rungs of the ladder. I've labelled the steps from 1 to 7 here. So at 1, our needle enters into the top fabric at this far right dot and comes out of the fabric at the next dot. That's 1 stitch. Number 2 takes us down to the bottom fabric where our needle now enters the dot at number 3 and comes out of the fabric at the next dot. That's our 2nd stitch. Step 4 takes us back up to the top fabric where we repeat the process again. Our needle enters into the top fabric and comes out of the top fabric. Step 6 takes us down to the bottom fabric. Our needle enters the bottom fabric and exits the bottom fabric. It's worth mentioning that if you are left-handed, this process will go from left to right as I'm drawing here, since your natural hand movements will flow in that direction. Okay, now's the point where you should have a needle and thread and whatever you are sewing with you so that we can do this together. The peachy linen is our top fabric here and our plain white is the bottom fabric. Most things that we mend or need to sew will have a seam allowance, which I have drawn here in grey and coloured in. This is usually about 1 centimetre of fabric that gives us space to sew without taking away from the final measurements of the thing that we're sewing. For the ladder stitch, we want to fold the seam allowance underneath so that it's hidden away from view and it gives us a nice clean edge to sew on. The easiest way to make sure this edge stays in place is to iron it. Iron it enough that the fold should stay in place without having to hold it. Once it's ironed, you can see how these 2 pieces of fabric will now probably look like whatever you're trying to mend, like a busted seam on a garment or a baby mat that you're trying to sew closed. Importantly, we need to remember that we're doing our stitches on the very edge of these folds. This will be trickier with thin fabrics because the folds will be quite narrow, while the baby playmat here was quite thick and there's a wider folded surface for me to stitch on. Before we start sewing, I'll transfer the dots onto the fabric so that it's clear for you to follow along to. If you have chalk or an erasable marker, something that will come out of your fabric or be hidden from view, you can also draw in some guidelines or some guide dots to help you get the hang of things. First things first, we need our needle and thread. I've threaded through the eye of my needle and I'm going to pull the thread all the way through until both ends of my thread are together. This means that my thread is now double. I've used a thick thread here for demonstration, but I do recommend you use a regular thin thread that colour matches as best as possible to whatever you're sewing so that the stitches end up as invisible as possible. Now we need to tie a knot somewhere on the inside of whatever we're sewing. Here I'm doing a tiny stitch on the seam allowance, remember that grey part that we folded on the inside, and then I'm tying a double knot. Most people probably tie a knot at the end of their thread, but I find that that can be a bit risky if your fabric is really loose because your thread could just pull right through. So like I said, I've done a tiny stitch and I've tied 2 knots on the inside. I also recommend keeping the knot tail and just push it right inside so that you can't see it. I'm going to clip mine so that it doesn't get in the way while I'm showing you this tutorial. Now we are ready to actually start stitching. We'll start right up here at the top right as step 1 on the top fabric. We want the needle to enter the top fabric at this dot on the very far right and come out at the dot next to it. Pull the thread through and that's our first stitch. Next, we come down to the bottom fabric where we want our needle to enter directly opposite where the thread is currently coming out of the top fabric. The needle goes into the bottom fabric and comes out of the bottom fabric. That's our second stitch. You'll notice I'm not pulling the thread all the way through just yet so you can see that bit of thread that is forming the ladder. I'm going to do a few more stitches before I pull them all through. Otherwise, it can make it more difficult to do the stitching if the fabric is already pulled tightly together. I will show you another view in a minute, so bear with me while we do a few more stitches to demonstrate. For our third stitch, we are back to the top fabric. We begin the same process again, where we enter the top fabric directly opposite where the thread is currently coming out of the bottom fabric. We put the needle in the top fabric and comes out of the top fabric, and that is our third stitch. This is the pattern that we will repeat until whatever you're sewing is closed. But do remember that every 4 or 5 rungs of the ladder that we sew, you'll need to pull your thread all the way through, making those ladder rungs disappear and bringing your top and bottom fabrics together. You don't want to do all of the stitches and wait until the very end to do one big pull because there'll be far too much tension to pull it neatly and you'll run the risk of breaking your thread and having to do it all over again. So again, I recommend every 4 to 5 rungs, pull your thread all the way through until your stitches become invisible. I will show you a few stitches from this angle, going through the same process. Remember, we are sewing on that very edge of that fold. Perhaps whatever you are sewing looks a little bit more like this. Same thing, we are going in and out of the top fabric, then we're jumping down to the bottom fabric with the needle going in and out. The difference here is that I've obviously pulled the thread all the way through, so you can't actually see those little ladder rungs. It's almost invisible already. It's up to you if you prefer stitching in this way or the way that I showed you previously. Sometimes it depends on how much of the fabric you can handle, which will dictate which style you might have to try and stitch with. Whichever view you choose, you'll need to tie another knot to keep your thread from coming undone. I do the same thing as when we started, sewing one tiny stitch and tying a double knot. So I hope that you enjoyed this video, but mostly I hope that it was helpful. I hope that you learned how to do the invisible ladder stitch successfully and that you can use it for all of your sewing and mending adventures. If you did use it and you found it helpful, please leave a comment. I love hearing how these videos can help you to mend your own things and to learn a little bit more about sewing. Like I said in the intro, I try to sew things that support a sustainable lifestyle. I just want to encourage others to try and take care of their wardrobes a little more and to treasure the things that we have, and I find the best kind of way I can do that is by sewing. If you found this style of video helpful, you might enjoy a few of my other videos. I have a range of videos up there. Wow, I'm just saying video a lot. I've tried to do a few vlog style videos showing things that I sew and taking you through a sewing day. I also have some basics videos about how to set up a sewing machine or using zigzag for beginners, so you can find all of those videos on my channel. What else? I think that's all. Thank you so much for watching this video. I'll see you in another one soon. Bye. Another example where I used it was to fix my little one's soft toy. We affectionately call this little vending machine toy Shabu. Don't know if that's the character's actual name or not. Somehow my little one managed to rip his head open. I should have done the stitches a tiny bit smaller so that it would have been even more invisible, but it did the job. It was a super quick mend and it had been sitting on the table for days waiting for me to mend. That's better. Ready to roll. Hi, I'm Esther and welcome back to Slow Living. I was about to say I'm Esther again. This is one of the most handy stitches, in my opinion. You can fix, mend, that's the same thing. Once you wrap your head around the concept, you won't forget it, I think. Hopefully. Let's get started before I keep talking.